Well, good morning, all. This is the last of the CC8 narrated PowerPoints, and this is just a summary PowerPoint really on government failure and some of the issues that the government faces when it comes to trying to address externalities, which is pretty much what we've been looking at through the whole of CC8. So this is the final one, as I said. It's basically a summary slide, or a few summary slides, and then a technique known as cost-benefit analysis that we'll be talking about too. So let's get cracking. So government failure. Then let's take a look at what that means and how that might actually affect things as we go. So issues around government failure. Again, I'm going to move myself over here so that you can see all of the text. So the first one. Okay, now clearly we talked about the fact that government might choose to use regulations which could include prohibition, could include taxation, to try to prevent or to reduce negative externalities and to reduce the consumption of demerit goods. So that's on the negative side. So trying to make sure that people aren't suffering from negative externalities to any large degree. Can also use regulations like compulsory consumption or subsidies to try to encourage people and the brand consumers to benefit from the positive externalities and consumption of merit goods, and obviously also to encourage producers to produce more where the social benefit of that particular good or service is significantly higher than that is being provided by producers without the subsidies being encouraged. Other things to bear in mind, obviously when we're talking about public goods, we've also got to bear in mind things like merit goods as well, like education, which is often provided by governments. So obviously state education is essentially provided by governments through the tax system, and we as taxpayers essentially pay for that. Other areas to bear in mind, price ceilings might be imposed below the free market price, and if you do that, the government is essentially then effectively distorting the market, distorting the free market in the way the free market might allocate resources, and that could actually create excess demand. Price floors as an alternative, or minimum legal prices like national minimum wages, don't tend to be about preventing prices from falling below a particular desired level. Obviously, in the case of the minimum wage, national minimum wage, it's not a price as such, it's the amount of money per hour that somebody is going to earn, and that national minimum wage is about trying to reduce poverty and also address some of the issues around distribution of income. The only issue can be that in some instances, much as the government might be trying to do it with all the right motivations, in some cases the government intervention might actually create rather than remove market distortions dependent on things like asymmetric information and maybe the government misinterpreting the information that they're being given to address some of the either positive or negative externalities that they're trying to address. And that government failure essentially happens when the intervention in a market basically fails to correct the market failure in the first instance, and in some cases might actually lead to outcomes that are even worse than the intervention was actually meant to correct. So obviously in this situation, it's more likely to be that market failure or that government failure is going to be associated to some degree with a misallocation of resources. And when we talk about the most efficient use of resources, remember that's one of the principles that we talk about as far as the economic problem is concerned. Scarcity of resources and unlimited needs and wants. So in terms of government failure then, what is it? Well, that's basically where the government may make decisions possibly based on inadequate information or also as a result of maybe conflicting objectives. That's something that we've looked at briefly and we'll look at again when we come to look at the national scenario as far as government trying to manage different objectives and manage the economy. And obviously, some of the administrative costs maybe of that government intervention could actually create a misallocation of resources and so lead to government failure. In some cases, clearly, it's a little bit difficult to interpret how markets are going to react if the government does choose to intervene, and in some cases, there could be some unintended consequences of that government failure. Not the government failure, the government intervention in those markets, which could potentially then lead to government failure. Some of the ways in which we can try and address that, and the way in which you might be trying to assess whether it's a good thing or a bad thing to either invest in a particular area or change the allocation of resources, is to go through a process known as cost-benefit analysis. And any of you that have done geography will probably be familiar with this principle of CBA, cost-benefit analysis, not the other CBA. So what is it? It's basically a technique which actually tries to assess both social costs and social benefits of an investment project over time. So interestingly, the fact that we talk about the social cost and the social benefits when we're trying to assess either external positive externalities or negative externalities, and trying to then look at where the government where the market is failing to provide this social optimum, then this could be a principle, and is certainly used quite a lot in fairly major public sector projects like road building, bridges and tunnels, as examples. The Severn Barrier, all those sorts of the big infrastructure projects that the government sometimes is involved in. Number one, allocating resources to, and number two, deciding on which the best option is to go for. There's quite a nice example here. It's a video which you need to click on the icon here on the gentleman here, and that basically will take you straight to a 4-minute video. It's quite quick, but I want you to note down some of the costs and benefits of a college education in the US and try and put some sort of value to that, and then also maybe consider whether you think college or university education is worth it given the costs and benefits. So it's weighing up the pros and the cons of a particular investment decision. In this case, it's about going to college. Other projects that you could consider, and these look more specifically at some of the big projects that maybe the government is having to consider. And of course, there is always an opportunity cost. If the government chooses to invest heavily in HS2, which is the high-speed rail link, and it's a very, very expensive. It's into 50-60 billion in terms of the cost of that. Clearly, if you choose to go for HS2, then you probably can't. Well, obviously, Crossrail is obviously being done at the moment too. But some of these issues, these other projects that you could choose, obviously there is an opportunity cost, as we mentioned, and the cost-benefit analysis is something that can be used to assess what the opportunity costs are, and also some of the alternatives that you might choose to go for if you were in a government scenario where you were trying to decide how you're going to allocate resources and tax revenues in order to move the economy forward. Are there any drawbacks to cost benefit analysis? Well, I think one of the issues is obviously looking at the values of the costs and benefits in some cases, and as with lots of these big infrastructure projects, the number of times that you hear that a big infrastructure project is running over budget, virtually every day we'll hear of one of the big infrastructure projects running wildly out of sync with the figures that they thought that they were originally going to be involved with. It tends to be quite a subjective exercise. So who's going to decide what to include and what to ignore? In some instances, it might be used as an exercise by the government to say, well, we've gone through the cost-benefit analysis and this is what we think we should do. And maybe there is some bias in that decision-making process to make it look like one particular project that might be a pet project of the government, it looks more beneficial than another. It may not cover everybody affected. More often than not, when we're talking about some of these big infrastructure projects, because they are so massive, the implications of them for people, individuals, businesses, consumers, sometimes they're not all thought through, and in some cases that might cause a bit of an issue. Can we look at future occurrences? Can we actually, in some senses, what we're having to do is future gaze and say, well, we think this is what's going to happen, but actually, in practice, it might be something completely different. So, again, can you fully account for all eventualities? Can be some political bias, as I mentioned, dependent on the particular infrastructure project and whether that fits with a political part of a political manifesto or part of a political sort of ethos as far as the sort of belief systems, if you like, of the politicians involved. And that basically covers the principle of cost-benefit analysis, and the government will try and use a cost-benefit analysis to some degree to try to assess the best way of using resources, the best way to allocate resources, and obviously if they can avoid backing the wrong horse, for want of a better term, or use some of these tools to actually try and apply a little bit of science to the way in which they might go about deciding these projects. That obviously is what cost-benefit analysis is all about, and it's about trying to avoid government failure as much as anything, given what we've just been talking about. So, thanks for listening. That's the final presentation on CC8. So that should give you all that you need to be able to crack on and make sure you understand CC8. And any bits that you don't understand, please, when we get back together after the summer holes, we'll go through that and make sure that any gaps in your knowledge are clearly filled as far as we can. Okay, thanks very much.